All right, everyone. Welcome to part five of the reading that never ends. But having said that, can you ever get enough Aristotle? I mean, the man was amazing. Just look at him, gorgeous. But uh, but yes, part five. We'll be looking at the second half of book two here. So chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Here, Aristotle really gets into the core of his moral philosophy, which is the virtue, where it comes from, how do we identify it, his examples of virtue and their extremes, how they relate to each other, and then the why it's so difficult to actually achieve a virtue, and why we should really hold people up in high regard if they can hit a virtue. So it's probably going to be a long recording, fair warning. But as with the other ones, stop at each of the chapter marks if you need to and take a break. Um, Otherwise, let's go. So, start with chapter 5. Here, Aristotle identifies where virtue must come from. Okay, the genus of moral virtue is a state of character, not a passion nor a capacity. Um, Next, we must consider what virtue is, since things that are found in the soul are of three kinds: passions, capacities, states of character. Virtue must be one of these. So, Aristotle is using the word soul here in probably a slightly different way than we usually do. And throughout the piece, he uses the word soul in probably a slightly different way. We could see what he's saying as soul as being sort of rational thought. Um, or consciousness maybe is a better way to think of it. So we're conscious of passions, capacities, and states of character. So if you've got issues with the word soul, it doesn't necessarily, although Aristotle did believe in the eternal soul, it doesn't necessarily have to be seen that way for the argument to still work. Okay, but continuing on. By passions, I mean appetite, anger, fear, confidence, envy, joy, friendly feelings, hatred, longing, emulation, pity, and in general the feelings that are accompanied by pleasure or pain. Okay, so, essentially emotions really is what Aristotle's talking about here, and yeah, really driven by pleasure and pain. By capacities, the things in virtue of which we are said to be capable of feeling these. For example, of becoming angry or being pained or feeling pity. By states of character, the things in virtue of which we stand well or badly with reference to the passions. For example, with reference to anger, we stand badly if we feel it violently or too weakly, and well if we feel it in an intermediate way, and similarly with reference to the other passions. So capacities, passions are kind of our feelings. They're driven by pleasure and pain. Capacity is what you're able to do. So it's kind of like your abilities, but your mental abilities. So what you're born mentally able to do. And then finally, states of character, which, Aristotle's, I think, making it pretty clear where he thinks the virtue lies. Uh, Now, neither the virtue nor the vices are passions, because we are not called good or bad on the grounds of our passions, but are so called on the grounds of our virtues and our vices, and because we are neither praised nor blamed for our passions. For the man who feels fear or anger is not praised, nor is the man who simply feels anger blamed, but the man who feels it in a certain way. But for our virtues and our vices, we are praised or blamed. So, what Aristotle's saying here, it's kind of like, looking at a child throwing a tantrum. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're a bad person. Um, they're still learning to control and temper their reliance on their passions, like how much their passion drives them. Um, so we don't really judge people based on their passions. If we're going to say that someone's bad for feeling angry about something, we're not really saying that they're bad for feeling anger. We're saying they're bad for feeling anger in the way that they are. So it's actually the fact that they're not controlling these passions, or perhaps that they're being driven by these passions too much. And so this is why it can't possibly be the virtue, because we do judge people based on their virtue, but we don't judge them based on their passions. Okay. Again, we feel anger and fear without choice, but the virtues are modes of choice or involve choice. Further, in respect of the passions, we are said to be moved, but in respect of the virtues and the vices, we are said not to be moved, but to be disposed in a particular way. So again, it can't virtue can't possibly lie in the passions because we choose to be virtuous. A lot of the time, we don't choose our passions. And if you think about it, you don't necessarily choose to become angry or to become sad or to become happy about things. That those emotions sort of just happen to you. Okay. Whereas virtue doesn't just happen, it has to be a choice. For these reasons, they are also not capacities, for we are neither we are neither called good or bad, nor praised or blamed for the simple capacity of feeling the passions. Again, we have the capacities by nature, but we are not made good or bad by nature. We have spoken of this before. So Aristotle here is saying something that he's touched on before, the idea that simply being able to do something is not the same as doing it. Okay. If you want to be a good person, you need to be a good person, not know how to be a good person. Okay. Me having the capacity to be good doesn't make me good, is what Aristotle's saying here. All right. If then the virtues are neither passions nor capacities, all that remains is that they should be states of character. Thus we have stated what virtue is in respect of its genus, or where virtue comes from. Virtue must come from a state of character. Okay, right at the start of that chapter, Aristotle sort of identifies that state of character, is state of character is concerned with finding the intermediate, and this is where he's going to say the virtue lies as well. So it all sort of knits together. Pretty straightforward chapter there, hopefully. Yeah, you got it. Chapter 6, Book 2. This is an important one, so make sure you're paying careful attention. This is where Aristotle identifies that virtue is a mean. Okay. Mean as in the mathematical mean, average, not mean as in a mean person. And so this is sort of the crux of virtue ethics, really. Okay. So the differentia of moral virtue, it is a disposition to choose the intermediate. Two kinds of intermediate are distinguished. So chapter 6, we must, however, not only describe virtue as a state of character, but also say what sort of state it is. We may remark then that every virtue or excellence both brings into good condition the thing of which it is the excellence and makes the work of that thing be done well. For example, the excellence of the eye makes both the eye and its work good, for it is by the excellence of the eye that we see well. So when we say that something's excellent, we're saying both that the thing itself is excellent and also that what it produces is excellent. So if I say you have excellent eyesight, what I'm saying is you have excellent eyes in terms of they do exactly what they're supposed to. You know, they focus the image on your retina really well or whatever. And then I'm also saying that they produce something that is excellent. So your ability to see is also excellent. So not only the thing itself, but also what it produces. Okay. Similarly, the excellence of the horse makes a horse both good in itself and good at running and at carrying its rider and at awaiting the attack of the enemy. Therefore, if this is true in every case, the virtue of man also will be the state of character which makes a man good and which makes him do his own work well. Um, so if we think about, using what I was talking about before, that excellence not only makes the thing good, but also what it produces. So virtue would make a person good and also make what they produce, their actions, good in themselves. Okay. How this is to happen we have stated already, but it will be made plain also by the following consideration of the specific nature of virtue. In everything that is continuous and divisible, it is possible to take more, less, or an equal amount, and that either in terms of the thing itself or relative to us. And the equal is an intermediate between excess and defect. Okay, so here we're starting to get into the idea of, excess, defect, and the mean. So in really everything, you can take too much, too little, or just the right amount. Um, by the intermediate in the object, I mean that which is equidistant from each of the extremes, which is one and the same for all. But the intermediate relatively to us, that which is neither too much nor too little. And this is not one nor the same for all. So an important point here, one that's often sort of misquoted, probably not misunderstood, but misquoted about Aristotle. It's really important to understand that the intermediate or the mean is not the middle point. It is the point that is correct for the person and the situation. So this will not always be the same. Your amount may be different to my amount. I may need more or less than you. But that would actually be the right amount for each of us. And Aristotle is going to explain this in a moment with an example. For instance, if 10 is many and 2 is few, 6 is the intermediate, taken in terms of the object, for it exceeds and is exceeded by an equal amount. This is intermediate according to arithmetical proportion. But the intermediate relatively to us is not to be taken so. If 10 pounds is too much for a particular person to eat, and 2 too little, it does not follow that the trainer will order 6 pounds. For this also is perhaps too much for the person who is to take it, or too little. Too little for Milo, too much for the beginner in athletic exercises. So Milo, Greek athlete, just to be clear. But Aristotle's clearly saying here, we're not talking about the mathematical middle point. All right. And to give you an example of this, because you might be sitting there going, oh, well, 2 pounds of food versus 10 pounds of food, 6 pounds is probably going to be about right for pretty much everyone. Well, maybe. But if I've got 1 pound of food and 100 pounds of food, does that mean that the right amount is 50 pounds? Well, no. No one could possibly eat this amount. Okay, and so this is what Aristotle's pointing out. We're not talking about the mathematical middle. We're talking about the correct amount for the person. And the example that he's got of Milo here, if someone is like an athlete, they're probably going to need to eat a lot more because they burn through a lot of energy each day. If someone is not, they should probably be eating less because their body doesn't require as much energy. All right, so hopefully that's making sense. The same is true of running and wrestling. Thus, a master of any art avoids excess and defect, but seeks the intermediate and chooses this, the intermediate, not in the object, but relatively to us. So it's not just about dividing things perfectly in half. It's about dividing them based on what is correct for the person. Okay, what is the right amount for me in this situation? If it is thus, then, that every art does its work well by looking to the intermediate and judging its work by this standard, so that we often say of good works of art that it is not possible either to take away or to add anything, implying that excess and defect destroy the goodness of works of art, while the mean preserves it, and good artists, as we say, look to this in their work. And if further virtue is more exact and better than any art, as nature also is, then virtue must have the quality of aiming at the intermediate. So, yeah, all this talk about art and artists and that sort of thing can be a bit confusing, but imagine someone going up to, the Mona Lisa or the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and going, yeah, it's good, but we just need to add like a little bit here. No. Okay, just no. It is perfect the way that it is. One brush stroke more or less would actually ruin it. Okay, it is a perfect piece of art. If you agree that those are examples of perfect works of art, which is very debatable, but you understand what I'm saying, I'm sure. Virtue is much more exact than art and much more important than art. And so, therefore, that idea is heightened even more. Okay, it is the exact right amount. It is not, one brush stroke more or less. It is, you know, point 0.1, not point 0.1 of a millimeter more or less. It is an absolutely exact amount. Uh, I mean moral virtue, for it is this that is concerned with passions and actions, and in these there is excess, defect, and the intermediate. For instance, both fear and confidence, and appetite and anger and pity, and in general pleasure and pain may be felt both too much and too little, and in both cases not well, but to feel them at the right times with reference to the right objects towards the right people with the right motive and in the right way is what is both intermediate and best. And this is characteristic of virtue. So all of those rights that we just heard, you know, the right time, the right objects, the right people, the right motive, the right way, this is what it is to be virtuous. So we can't say something as broad as to get angry is virtuous or to not get angry is virtuous. No, it's to feel anger uh, at the right time with reference to the right object towards the right people with the right motive and in the right way. That is what the virtue is. Okay. Um, Similarly, with regard to actions, also, uh, there is excess, defect, and the intermediate. Now, virtue is concerned with passions and actions in which excess is a form of failure, and so is defect, while the intermediate is praised and is a form of success, and being praised and being successful are both characteristic of virtue. Therefore, virtue is a kind of mean, since, as we have seen, it aims at what is intermediate. So Aristotle's really like outlining the theory here, virtue lying as a mean between excess and deficiency, because we are praised and are successful based on this idea. Okay. Uh, Again, it is possible to fail in many ways, for evil belongs to the class of the ultimate. Sorry, not ultimate, unlimited. Uh, for evil belongs to the class of the unlimited, as the Pythagoreans conjectured, and good to that of the limited. While to succeed is possible only in one way, for which reason also one is easy and the other difficult. To miss the mark easy, to hit it difficult. And for these reasons also then, excess and defect are characteristic of vice, and the mean of virtue. For men are good in but one way, but bad in many. Okay, so that quote there, the virtue is difficult because it is an exact point. And if you think of an archery target, it is the exact bullseye, like the actual exact precise center of the target. Um, and to say that you've hit the bullseye, you must hit that mark. Okay, that is what hitting the bullseye actually is. Um, you can miss in lots of different ways. You go too high, too low, too far to the left, too far to the right, and then there's degrees of that, far too high or only a little bit too high. You can miss the bullseye in millions of ways, but you can only hit the bullseye in one way. And as it is with virtue, you can only be virtuous in one very precise way, but you can be, you can perform vice in a million different ways. Okay. Virtue then is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean, the mean relative to us, this being determined by reason, and by that reason by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. So remember, practical wisdom, so real world understanding. Uh, Now, it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect. And again, it is a mean because the vices respectively fall short of or exceed what is right in both passions and actions, while virtue both finds and chooses that which is intermediate. Hence, in respect of what it is, the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean with regard to what is best and right, um, with regard to what is best and right and extreme. Okay. Um, so really, we've heard the same thing again here that we've sort of been talking about already. Virtue is the mean. It lies between the excesses of defect and excess. Uh, yes. Okay, sorry, getting myself confused. Between the extremes of defect and excess, that's what it is. But not every action or every passion admits of a mean, for some have names that already imply badness. So not everything possesses a mean, Aristotle is saying. For example, spite, shamelessness, envy, and in the case of actions, adultery, theft, murder. For all of these and such like things imply by their names that they are themselves bad, and not the excess or deficiencies of them. So there's not a right amount of adultery that you can commit. Um, it, any amount is incorrect. So there's no virtue attached to adultery. Okay. Um, It is not possible then ever to be right with regard to them. One must always be wrong. Nor does goodness or badness with regard to such things depend on committing adultery with the right woman at the right time and in the right way, but simply to do any of them is to go wrong. Okay, so yeah, and you often hear people trying to justify things like adultery by saying, "Oh, I was drunk," or I was out of town," or blah 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 blah. No, there is no right person, no right amount, no right state that ever permits adultery. It's just wrong. There's no other way to twist it. Okay, don't cheat on people, kids. It would be equally absurd then to expect that in unjust, cowardly, and self-indulgent action there should be a mean, an excess, and a deficiency. For at that rate there would be a mean of excess and of deficiency, an excess of excess, and a deficiency of deficiency. Um, but as there is no excess and deficiency of temperance and courage, because what is intermediate is in a sense an extreme, so too of the actions we have mentioned, there is no mean nor any excess and deficiency. But however they are done, they are wrong. For in general, there is neither a mean of excess and deficiency, nor excess and deficiency of a mean. So Aristotle's just being very clear here. The mean itself is not on a scale. Okay, it is a very precise thing. It's a precise action that must be performed. The excesses, or the excess and deficiency, the two extremes, they don't have a mean within them. Okay, so to use an example that we've talked about in class, and that Aristotle's going to talk about in a moment, courage is the mean. There's no there's no such thing as too much courage or too little courage. Courage is the virtue, it is a precise mark, and it is always correct. Then we've got the excess of rashness and the defect of cowardliness. There's no such thing as a correct amount of rashness. There's no such thing as a mean of rashness. Okay? And there's no such thing as a mean of cowardliness. Otherwise, this would kind of be like someone who, in archery missed the bullseye, but then said, yeah, but I was aiming for the point that I was aiming at. And then you go and you hit a different point and say, yeah, but that's the point I was aiming at. Like, there is no target then. There might as well be no target at all. You're aiming at the bullseye. All of you are aiming at the bullseye. And if you missed it, you missed it. Don't try and justify it by saying that that's what you were aiming at. I was aiming to be rash. Okay, or I was aiming to be cowardly. Well, then you are aiming to be wrong, to be a bad person. Okay, but yeah, that's what Aristotle's saying here. There are some things where there is no mean, such as adultery, and we need to understand that of the things that do have a mean, that is a precise point, and that is the only mean that exists. There is no mean of rashness and no mean of cowardliness. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. We'll keep ticking along. So Book 2, Chapter 7. Here, Aristotle just gives a whole bunch of examples of the virtue. Hopefully, you've written these down in your book as we've gone through them. I'll run through it. I'll do this chapter pretty quickly because we have talked about the virtues. In terms of what you need to know, you don't need to know every single one of these virtues. I'd be thinking about the ones that will be most useful for what we're going to be discussing. So, for the exam often has questions, particularly essay questions about, our obligation to help others, or our reliance on technology and lack of self-control around it and that sort of thing. So I'd be thinking about the virtues that relate to those things and remembering those. But you don't need to memorize all of them. Obviously, it would be great if you did, but yeah, focus on the ones that you feel like will be most useful. I've got a couple there, just the first three that pop up in the reading. And yeah, let's get through this chapter pretty quickly though. So the above proposition illustrated by reference to particular virtues. Chapter 7. We must, however, not only make this general statement, but also apply it to the individual facts. For among statements about conduct, those which are general apply more widely, but those which are particular are more true, since conduct has to do with individual cases, and our statements must harmonize with the facts in these cases. We may take these cases from our table. With regard to feelings of fear and confidence, courage is the mean. With regard to feelings, is the mean. Of the people who exceed, he who exceeds in fearlessness has no name. Many of the states have no name, while the man who exceeds in confidence is rash. And he who exceeds in fear and falls short in confidence is a coward. With regard to pleasures and pains, not all of them, and not so much with regard to the pains. The mean is temperance. So temperance is particularly to do with pleasures, not particularly pains. The excess of this scale is self-indulgence, so the person who just indulges in pleasures. Person's defect with regard to pleasures are not often found. Hence, such persons also have received no name, but let us call them insensible. So it's really rare that people don't partake in the pleasures. It's much more common that they do. But this means that we kind of have to make up a name for them, and we'll call them insensible. With regard to giving and taking of money, the mean is liberality. The excess and the defect, prodigality and meanness. In these actions, people exceed and fall short in contrary ways. The prodigal exceeds in spending and falls short in taking, while the mean man exceeds in taking and falls short in spending. So the prodigal man is kind of the person who spends money more than they earn. Like, they have very little self-control over the money they spend. If they see something and they want it, they buy it. This is the type of person who ends up racking up massive credit card debt. Okay. Meanness is the type of person who has plenty of money in the bank, but they refuse to spend money even when it would be reasonable to spend it. Okay. So this is the very sort of stingy person, is a good way to think about it. At present, we are giving a mere outline or summary and are satisfied with this. Later, these states will be more exactly determined. With regard to money, there are also other dispositions. A mean of magnificence, for the magnificent man differs from the liberal man. The former, the magnificent man, deals with large sums. The latter, the liberal man, deals with small ones. An excess is tastelessness and vulgarity, and a deficiency is niggardliness, or once again, sort of stinginess, but on like a grand scale, if that makes sense. These differ from the states opposed to liberality, and the mode of their difference will be stated later. But liberality is to do with smaller sums of money, magnificence with larger sums of money. So, with liberality, you could think about this in terms of spending money. With magnificence, you could think about it in terms of large sums of money, like, the houses that people live in and that sort of thing. Okay. With regard to honor and dishonor, the mean is proper pride. The excess is known as a sort of empty vanity, and the deficiency is undue humility. And as we say, liberality was related to magnificence, differing from it by dealing with small sums. So there is a state similarly related to proper pride, being concerned with small honours, while that is concerned with great. For it is possible to desire honour as one ought, and more than one ought, and less. And the man who exceeds in his desires is called ambitious. The man who falls short, unambitious, while the intermediate person has no name. So in this case, the virtue actually doesn't have a name. Um, excuse me. The dispositions also are nameless, except that that of the ambitious man is called ambition. Hence, the people who are at the extremes lay claim to the middle place, and we ourselves sometimes call the intermediate person ambitious, and sometimes unambitious, and sometimes praise the ambitious man, and sometimes the unambitious. The reason of our doing this will be stated in what follows, but now let us speak of the remaining states according to the method which has been indicated. So Aristotle sort of talked there, just in sort of a little bit of an aside, he talked about the idea that a lot of the times we fool ourselves and tell ourselves that we are being virtuous when actually we're not. So the ambitious person will say that they're virtuous, and the person who's at the actual mean is unambitious, when that's not actually true. They're so clouded by their view of the state of affairs that they don't even understand where the virtue is and that they're not hitting it. Okay, so we have to be really careful about who we follow with this sort of stuff, because someone might say that they are courageous when actually they're rash and they just don't see it because they've lost sight of the virtue. Um, with regard to anger also, there is an excess, a deficiency, and a mean. Although they can scarcely be said to have names, yet since we call the intermediate person good-tempered, let us call the mean good temper. Of the person at the extremes, let the one who exceeds be called irascible, and his vice irascibility, and the man who falls short an unirascible sort of person, and the deficiency unirascibility. Um, there are also three other means which have a certain likeness to one another but differ from one another, for they are all concerned with intercourse in words and actions, but differ in that one is concerned with truth in this sphere, the other two with pleasantness, and of this one kind is exhibited in giving amusement, the other in the circumstances of life. We must therefore speak of these two, that we may better see that in all things the mean is praiseworthy, and the extremes neither praiseworthy nor right, but worthy of blame. Now, most of these states have no names, but we must try, as in the other cases, to invent names ourselves so that we may be clear and easy to follow. With regard to truth, so that whole section sort of didn't say a whole lot, but here we go. With regard to truth, then, the intermediate is a truthful sort of person, and the mean may be called truthfulness, while the pretense which exaggerates is boastfulness, and the person characterized by it a boaster, and that which understates is mock modesty, and the person characterized by it mock modest. Okay, so think of this in terms of like storytelling. You know, there's when people tell stories, some people will tell you the truth of what happened. Some people like to add a lot of, hyperbole and uh, add a lot of drama. Okay, so this is the boastful sort of person. Like, and then I lifted the car up one hand and dragged the baby out. Did you? Really? Okay. And then there's the person who is really dull to listen to because they don't include the details that are interesting. And it's like, yeah, there was a car accident. Wow. What a story. More dragons next time, bro. But so mock modest, love that mock modesty. If you haven't seen, if you've never listened to B-52's Rock Lobster, every time I read the words mock modest, I think of B-52's Rock Lobster. Rock Lobster. Oh, Rock Lobster. Do yourself a favor, jump on YouTube, B-52's Rock Lobster. With regard to pleasantness in the giving of amusement, the intermediate person is ready-witted, and the disposition ready-wit. The excess is buffoonery, and the person characterized by it a buffoon, while the man who falls short is a sort of bore, and his state is boorishness. With regard to the remaining kind of pleasantness, that which is exhibited in life in general, the man who is pleasant in the right way is friendly, and the mean is friendliness, while the man who exceeds in an is an obsequious person if he has no end in view, a flatterer if he is aiming at his own advantage, and the man who falls short and is unpleasant in all circumstances is a quarrelsome and surly sort of person. There are also means in the passions and concerned with the passions, since shame is not a virtue, and yet praise is extended to the modest man. For even in these matters, one man is said to be intermediate, and another to exceed. As, for instance, the bashful man who is ashamed of everything, while he who falls short or is not ashamed of anything at all is shameless, and the intermediate person is modest. Righteous indignation is a mean between envy and spite, and these states are concerned with the pain and pleasure that are felt at the fortunes of our neighbours. The man who is characterized by righteous indignation is pained at undeserved good fortune. The envious man, going beyond him, is pained at all good fortune. And the spiteful man falls so far short of being pained that he even rejoices. But these states there will be an opportunity of describing elsewhere. With regard to justice, since it has not one simple meaning, we shall, after describing the other states, distinguish its two kinds and say how each of them is a mean. And similarly, we shall treat also the rational virtues. So, lots of examples of the virtues there. As I said right at the start, pick a few that you feel like will be useful. Have a look at some of the old VCAA exam questions and the short answer questions that they've asked about Aristotle. They generally ask the same sort of questions, okay, because they're always asking about how the texts relate to each other. Some of these virtues are going to be much more useful than others, and I'd be thinking in that sort of vein for determining which ones to try and memorize. Temperance is always a good one. But book 2, chapter 8, almost there. Okay. So here Aristotle outlines the relationship between the mean and the extremes. Basically, everything is the opposite of everything. Okay. So here we go. Characteristics of the extreme and mean states, practical corollaries. The extremes are opposed to each other and to the mean. There are three kinds of disposition then, two of them vices involving excess and deficiency respectively, and one a virtue, namely the mean, and all are in a sense opposed to all, for the extreme states are contrary both to the intermediate state and to each other, and the intermediate to the extremes, as the equal is greater relative to the less, less relative to the greater. So the middle states are excessive relative to the deficiencies, deficient relative to the excesses, both in passions and in actions. So again, he's just sort of outlining the relationship between these things here. We have to be really careful because the deficiency looks like, the mean looks like a deficiency when looked at from the excess. The mean looks like an excess when looked at from the deficiency. So we just need to be really careful about our perspective because that will determine whether we're actually identifying the mean or not. There are, what did I get up to? Both in passions and in actions, I believe. So, for the brave man appears rash relative to the coward, and the cowardly relatively to the rash man. And similarly, the temperate man appears self-indulgent relatively to the insensible man, insensible relatively to the self-indulgent man. And the liberal man prodigal relative to the mean man, whereas mean relative to the prodigal. Hence also the people at the extremes push the intermediate man each over to the other, and the brave man is called rash by the coward, cowardly by the rash man, and correspondingly in other cases. So again, perspective. Be very careful about this because it will make you unable to identify the virtue. These states being thus opposed to one another, the greatest contrariety uh, is that of the extremes to each other, rather than to the intermediate. For these are further from each other than from the intermediate, as the great is further from the small, and the small from the great, than both are from the equal. So the things that are most opposed to each other are the extremes of excess and deficiency. Um, they are the most opposed to each other. Again, uh, did I read that? No. Again, to the intermediate, some extremes show a certain likeness, as that of rashness to courage and that of prodigality to liberality. But the extremes show the greatest unlikeness to each other. Now, contraries are defined as the things that are furthest from each other, so that things that are further apart are more contrary. Okay, so excess and deficiency will always be more contrary to each other than they are to the mean, but that's not to say that the mean is the same as the excess or the deficiency. It is a different thing and it is opposed to both of them. To the intermediate, in some cases, the deficiency. In some, the excess is more opposed. It is not rashness, which is an excess, but cowardice, which is a deficiency that is more opposed to courage, and not insensibility, which is a deficiency, but self-indulgence, which is an excess that is more opposed to temperance. So here Aristotle sort of saying that courage usually falls closer to the rash side than it does to the cowardly side. Okay, temperance usually falls closer to the what's the self-disciplined to the insensible side than to the self-indulgent side. Okay, so we would be correct in saying that courage is more opposed to cowardliness than it is to rashness, but that's not to say that it's not opposed to rashness. It is, but it is actually further away from cowardliness. This happens from two reasons, one being drawn from the thing itself. For because one extreme is nearer and liker to the intermediate, we oppose not this, but rather its contrary to the intermediate. For example, since rashness is thought more like and nearer to courage, and cowardice more unlike, we oppose rather the latter to courage. For things that are further from the intermediate are thought more contrary to it. If you think about this, this is true. Whilst we might look at someone who is rash and think, well, they're a bit stupid or they don't think things through properly. The people that we really hold contempt for are the cowards. Okay, the people who are cowardly. Um, they are the people who we really look down on and think are bad people. We don't actually think that rash people are bad people. Usually we think they're just silly people or they're idiots. Um, but cowards are the ones that we really judge. So it is sort of true what Aristotle's saying here. This then is one cause drawn from the thing itself, another is drawn from ourselves, for the things to which we ourselves more naturally tend seem contrary to the intermediate. For instance, we ourselves tend more naturally to pleasures, and hence are more easily carried away towards self-indulgence than towards propriety. We describe as contrary to the mean, then, rather the directions in which we more often go to great lengths, and therefore self-indulgence, which is an excess, is the more contrary to temperance. So Aristotle's sort of saying here that when in doubt, look at what you're being drawn to or away from, because quite often you're being drawn to pleasures, and that's actually moving you further away from the virtue. So, for example, with temperance, we're usually drawn to self-indulgence, and that's really far away from temperance. So, whereas being insensible is actually closer to temperance. So pay attention to what you're being drawn to, because you're probably being drawn to the extreme that is furthest away from the virtue, okay, or more contrary. Please remember though, the opposite extreme is not the virtue. It's just that you are at least closer to the virtue. It's the difference between someone hitting the real edge of a target in archery and someone missing the bullseye by 1 centimeter. Okay. Neither of them have hit the bullseye, but one person is closer than the other. Like one person we would look at and go, well, you gave it a real good try. The other person we would say, well, you were way off. Okay. So book two, chapter nine, last one. And in this one, Aristotle's going to tell us something that he's been building to the whole time, and that is relatively obvious, that the mean is really, really, really hard to hit. But he's also going to identify that we need to be very careful. Sorry, not careful. There's a way that we can sort of train ourselves. If you're not sure where the virtue is, aim at the extreme, which it is usually closest to. Okay. The mean is hard to attain and is grasped by perception, not by reasoning. That moral virtue is a mean, then, and in what sense it is so, and that it is a mean between two vices, and the one involving excess, the other deficiency, and that it is such because its character is to aim at what is intermediate in passions and in actions, has been sufficiently stated. Hence also it is no easy task to be good. For everything it is no easy task to find the middle. For example, to find the middle of a circle is not for everyone, but for him who knows. So too, anyone can get angry. That is easy. Or give or spend money. But to do this to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive, and in the right way, that is not for everyone. Nor is it easy. Wherefore, goodness is both rare and laudable and noble. So Aristotle now has used the analogy of mathematics and geometry quite a few times, and I think it's worth looking at here. Not everyone can find the middle point of a circle. It takes a certain amount of training and study to understand the theories and then actually be able to apply that correctly to find the middle point of a circle. This is not easy to do. And this is what Aristotle's pointing out here. Uh, it's the same with being virtuous. Um, Not everyone is well suited to this because it takes a lot of discipline, it takes a lot of study, it takes a lot of practice to become a virtuous person. Uh, and just like an archer who trains a lot will eventually get to the point where they can quite confidently hit the bullseye, the virtuous person trains a lot and will eventually quite confidently be able to hit the virtue, but not everyone is willing to put that training in. Okay. And so, real goodness, someone who is really virtuous, this is someone we should really hold up. Um, Hence, he who aims at the intermediate must first depart from what is the more contrary to it. As Calypso advises, hold the ship out beyond the surf and the spray. In other words, while we're learning where the virtue is, we need to move as far away from the opposite vice as we possibly can. So while I'm learning what courage is, I need to make sure that I'm not cowardly. Okay, I need to move as far away from cowardliness as I possibly can. So this might mean that I actually overshoot and I become rash. But remember, at least I'm closer to the virtue there. I'm still not virtuous, but I'm the archer this time who missed by 1 centimeter instead of missing the target altogether. Okay. Um, For to the extremes one is more erroneous, one less so. Therefore, since to hit the mean is hard in the extreme, we must, as a second best, as people say, take the least of the evils, and this will be done best in the way we describe. But we must consider the things towards which we ourselves also are easily carried away. For some of us tend to one thing, some to others. Some to another. And this will be recognizable from the pleasure and the pain we feel. We must drag ourselves away to the contrary extreme, for we shall get into intermediate state by drawing well away from error, as people do in straightening sticks that are bent. So I love this little analogy that Aristotle uses here. If you imagine trying to straighten a bent stick, you don't actually do that by straightening the stick. You do it by bending it past the point of it being straight. And you keep doing that until it has straightened. What will likely happen is you'll bend it to the point where it actually bends the opposite way, but you should be closer to being straight. So now you bend it back the other way and you get a little bit closer to being straight again and back the other way, back the other way, back the other way until you've actually got a straight stick. Aristotle is saying the same is true for us. And we need to be really aware of what we're like naturally. Okay, so um, if you are naturally a a rash person, like you just jump headlong into things, then you need to practice being cowardly, which sounds weird because it's further away from the virtue, but you're naturally disposed to rashness. So being more rash is not going to get you any closer to the virtue. You're already at that full extreme. So you're sort of pushed hard up against that glass. What you need to do is push the other way. Okay, go the other side, just like bending a stick back. Now, in everything, the pleasant or pleasure is most to be guarded against, for we do not judge it impartially. We ought then to feel towards pleasure as the elders of the people felt towards Helen, and in all circumstances repeat their saying. For if we dismiss pleasure, thus we are less likely to go astray. It is by doing this, then, to sum the matter up, that we shall be best able to hit the mean. Aristotle's saying what we really need to be careful of is that we need to be very careful of being guided by our pleasure. We can't let pleasure drive us, if that makes sense, because it's going to push us away from the virtue. But this is no doubt difficult, and especially in individual cases, for it is not easy to determine both how and with whom and on what provocation and how long one should be angry. For we too sometimes praise those who fall short and call them good-tempered, but sometimes we praise those who get angry and call them manly. The man, however, who deviates little from goodness is not blamed, whether he do so in the direction of the more or the less, but only the man who deviates more widely, for he does not fail to be noticed. So Aristotle's sort of saying here, look, it is really hard to be virtuous, and that should be your goal, but we never look at the archer who misses the bullseye by 1 centimeter and go, what a terrible archer. We look at them and go, man, he was so close. Okay. The same is true with the virtues. If you're slightly off, people are probably going to look at you and go, I see what you were trying to do. You were really trying to do the right thing. And you're probably going to be commended for that. You're not going to be virtuous, but you're going to be commended for that. Who do we notice? It's the person who misses the target altogether. They're the ones that we really notice. Okay. And they are more wrong, or they are worse than the ones who at least get close. All right, so finishing off, but up to what point and to what extent a man must deviate before he becomes blameworthy, it is not easy to determine by reasoning, any more than anything else that is perceived by the senses. Such things depend on particular facts, and the decision rests with perception. So much then is plain that the intermediate state is in all things to be praised, but that we must incline sometimes towards the excess, sometimes towards the deficiency, for so shall we most easily hit the mean and what is right. Okay, so when in doubt, aim towards the excess that is closest to the virtue. Be very wary of pleasure and the role that it plays in driving you away. Be very aware of your own character. And if you know yourself to be, for example, a cowardly person, then be rash. But if you know yourself to be a rash person, don't be rash just because courage is usually on the side of rashness. You're already too rash. You need to bend the stick back the other way. So you need to act cowardly. Because you're probably going to slowly correct to the right point. Takes time, takes thought, takes training, and these recordings have taken my life. So hopefully Aristotle has been cleared up for you. He is a very, very good philosopher, in my opinion, probably the best. But the man can waffle. He can waffle on. I hope you enjoyed it. Rock Lobster, look it up. But I'll see you for the next text. Bye.